Question. I think the good news is that like people in terms of like consumers are much more aware about their personal privacy rights than they were say 10 years ago.
Right.
And if you look at sort of early social media or ad tech, there was a whole stream of essentially companies that were really monetizing by gobbling up personal data and then kind of like converting it into cash. And there was this, I think growing sentiment at that time that from some of the leaders of those companies that like, privacy is dead, everything, people are going to put everything online. No one really cares anymore. We're just going to, have all of our personal information out there, and your personal privacy is, less important. But I think that people eventually sort of woke up to those, Wild West days of data.
Right.
And also with the introduction of GDPR in 2018, that woke a lot of people up as well as a lot of companies. And it's become sort of like a forcing function for people to realize and care about this. But I think it's like a natural thing that you see with any, innovation that happens or any types of trends. There's this like expansion, and then we kind of go too far in one direction, and then there's like a contraction where maybe we contract too much. I think you see the similar things with market dynamics when it comes to like investing and so forth. Like a couple of years ago, companies got super overvalued, and then there was a huge contraction, and now companies probably for the last year and a half or so are probably undervalued, and at some point it kind of bounces back. And I think we've gone through a similar place when it comes to privacy, and but people are now a lot more aware of it. And if you look at the world of like LLMs and generative AI, which is a new sort of landscape for many people, the good thing there is people are asking a lot of the right questions and have the right concerns when it comes to privacy. Now, on the sort of flip side of that, the bad news is that data breaches aren't going away; they're getting worse. There was actually an MIT report by Dr. Madnick that came out recently that showed that data breaches are essentially an epidemic. Like there's 2.6 billion personal records that have been exposed in the last 2 years. So clearly the industry is really failing to address this problem. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fundamental flaw about our understanding of the nature of data, which goes back to essentially like the 1980s. So when we were first building software that was going to be used in businesses back in the early 80s, when we were essentially going from a completely paper world to somewhat digitalized world, the original software that companies were using, essentially all data was treated as ones and zeros. It was all essentially the same because it didn't really matter. Essentially, the data that you were collecting about like customers or about employees, you were managing that essentially in a self-contained box because we were in a disconnected world that existed previous to the internet. So even if somebody had bad intention, they essentially had to like break into your company and physically steal a box or the hard drive to get access to the information. And the world has changed a lot since then. We've kind of taken that same way of thinking where we've treated essentially someone's social security number or someone's, healthcare information the same way as, a click on the website. We've done that now to the scale of the cloud and to millions, if not billions of consumers. And that causes major, major problems. We end up with this huge data replication problem where instead of having one copy of someone's, phone number or home address, we end up with thousands of different copies. And then we need to have to protect all those different locations. And then because of, I think, this fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of data, we end up with what I call sort of the wine and the cheese problem. So think of it like if you had in your house, or sorry, actually the diamond and the cheese problem. So think of it in your house. Let's say that you had diamonds and you had cheese. Then when I have essentially people over to my house, I want them to have access to my cheese because I want to be a good host. So they should be able to help themselves to the cheese. They can go in the refrigerator, cut themselves off some cheese, have a nice little snack. But if I also have diamonds, I want to limit essentially the access to
Right.
my diamonds. I don't want just anybody, even if they're a good friend, I don't necessarily want them having access to my diamonds, right? But if I store the diamonds in the same place as my cheese in my refrigerator, then it's very hard for me to control access to the diamonds in a different way than I control access to cheese. And that's essentially the problem that we have when it comes to data when we treat it all the same. We put essentially personal information about people in the same location as all other transactional and application data. And then it becomes very, very difficult for us to essentially separate the rules of engagement for how to access that information. And I think that's essentially what leads to all of these different problems that we have when it comes to data breaches.